My name is Emily Carter, and I was born in a small coastal town in Oregon before eventually moving to Chicago to teach advanced communication and English fluency to international students from all over the world. I've spent more than 12 years studying how people connect emotionally through language, and one thing has always fascinated me. Many learners can memorize grammar perfectly, yet they still freeze when real conversations begin. Today, I want to guide you through the first and perhaps most important stage of becoming a truly confident English speaker, the art of breaking awkward silence and creating deep, meaningful conversations that feel natural instead of forced. When I first became a teacher in America, I believed vocabulary alone would help my students communicate. However, I quickly realized that emotional comfort mattered even more than technical accuracy. In this lesson, I will share my own experiences, cultural observations, practical expressions, and psychological insights to help you move beyond basic small talk and begin conversations that people genuinely remember long after they end. I still remember one winter evening in Chicago when I attended a networking event filled with business professionals wearing dark suits and polite smiles that looked carefully rehearsed. The room sounded lively on the surface, yet almost every conversation felt painfully shallow. People kept asking questions like, "How are you?" or "Do you like the event?" And the answers never lasted longer than a few seconds. I stood near the coffee table listening carefully, and I realized the real problem was not language ability, but the structure of the questions themselves, because yes or no questions naturally close conversations instead of opening them. A young engineer from Brazil eventually approached me nervously and asked, "Do you enjoy teaching?" And although I answered politely, I could feel the conversation dying immediately afterward. Instead of allowing the silence to grow heavier, I smiled warmly and asked him, "What inspired you to become an engineer in the first place?" And within seconds, his entire face changed because suddenly he had a story to tell instead of a simple answer to provide. That moment taught me something I now repeat constantly to my students. Open-ended questions are emotional doors, while closed questions are emotional walls. When you ask someone, "Did you enjoy your vacation?" the person can simply say, "Yes, I did," and the discussion may collapse instantly. However, when you ask, "What was the most unforgettable part of your vacation?" you invite emotion, memory, and personality into the conversation. Human beings naturally enjoy talking about experiences that shaped them, especially when they feel sincerely heard instead of mechanically questioned. I often encourage my students to imagine conversations as tennis matches, because if one person gives short answers without emotional movement, the ball stops traveling back and forth. In American culture, especially in workplaces and social gatherings, people often appreciate curiosity that feels authentic rather than robotic politeness that sounds memorized from a textbook. Several years ago, one of my Japanese students named Haruki struggled terribly with social interaction despite having excellent grammar and pronunciation. He once told me, "I know many English words, but I never know how to continue conversations after the first sentence." And I could hear genuine frustration in his voice because loneliness often hides beneath communication difficulties. During one lesson, I asked him to stop focusing on perfect grammar and instead focus entirely on curiosity, because curiosity creates natural fluency faster than memorization alone. I gave him a challenge during a university event. Instead of asking classmates predictable questions, he needed to ask emotionally engaging ones like, "What kind of experiences changed your personality the most?" Or, "What's something you've always wanted to do but never had the courage to try?" A week later, he entered my classroom smiling more confidently than I had ever seen before, and he admitted that several conversations unexpectedly lasted over an hour simply because people felt emotionally involved. The psychology behind meaningful conversation is deeply connected to safety and attention because people open themselves gradually when they sense genuine interest from the listener. Many English learners mistakenly believe fluency means speaking nonstop. However, truly charismatic communicators often spend more time guiding conversations than dominating them. I once met an elderly journalist in New York who told me, "The secret to becoming unforgettable is making other people feel unforgettable first." And that sentence permanently changed how I approached communication. Whenever you ask thoughtful questions, your role shifts from performer to emotional guide, and that subtle difference removes enormous pressure from your shoulders. Instead of worrying constantly about impressing people with advanced vocabulary, you begin focusing on understanding them, and ironically, that mindset often makes your English sound far more natural and sophisticated. When conversations become slightly deeper, another challenge appears almost immediately, the fear of silence while thinking about what to say next. I experienced this myself when I first started teaching adult business professionals because I sometimes needed extra time to organize my thoughts carefully during discussions about culture, psychology, or communication strategy. In American conversational culture, silence that lasts too long can feel uncomfortable, so native speakers frequently use small filler expressions to create breathing space while thinking. Expressions such as, "actually, to be honest," "well," or "as far as I'm concerned," may seem unimportant at first glance, yet they perform a crucial psychological function because they signal that your mind is actively processing ideas instead of freezing completely. I often explain to students that fillers are not signs of weakness. They are conversational bridges that maintain rhythm and emotional flow while your brain prepares the next sentence. I remember teaching a workshop for international employees at a technology company in Seattle, where one participant from Germany constantly panicked whenever discussions moved too quickly. Every time someone asked for his opinion, he would become silent for several seconds before speaking, and unfortunately those pauses made him appear less confident than he truly was. During a practice exercise, I encouraged him to begin responses with phrases like, "That's an interesting question, actually," or, "To be honest, I've been thinking about that quite a lot lately," because these expressions bought him valuable thinking time while sounding calm and professional. The transformation was remarkable because his speech suddenly felt smoother even though his grammar had not changed significantly. More importantly, he stopped fearing silence because he finally understood that conversations do not require instant perfection. They require emotional continuity. One evening after class, I sat inside a crowded cafe with several students discussing why some conversations feel effortless while others feel painfully exhausting. A woman from South Korea quietly observed that many people ask questions only because social rules require them to, not because they truly care about the answers. Her comment stayed in my mind for months because she had identified something profoundly important about communication. Authenticity can often be heard even when words themselves remain simple. If you ask someone, "What do you enjoy doing?" with distracted eyes and mechanical energy, the conversation will probably remain superficial. However, if you lean slightly forward and ask warmly, "What kind of activities make you completely forget about time?" the emotional atmosphere changes instantly. Deep conversation is not created by complicated vocabulary alone. It is created by emotional presence, thoughtful curiosity, and genuine listening. As my teaching career continued, I became increasingly aware that workplace conversations require a slightly different type of ice-breaking compared to casual social situations. At parties, people often tolerate randomness and spontaneity more easily. However, professional environments usually demand smoother transitions and subtle respect for boundaries. I once coached a nervous marketing intern before her first corporate conference in Boston, and she admitted she was terrified of approaching experienced executives because she feared sounding foolish. Instead of teaching her dramatic networking tricks, I encouraged her to begin with observations connected naturally to the environment by saying things like, "This presentation raised some interesting ideas about remote work," or I noticed your team asked a fascinating question during the discussion earlier. These openings worked beautifully because they felt organic rather than intrusive, allowing conversations to develop gradually without emotional pressure. Another extremely useful strategy involves transforming ordinary observations into emotionally engaging questions that invite longer responses. Imagine attending a company event where someone mentions they recently moved to another city. Many learners would respond with, "Do you like it there?" Which often leads to short answers. However, a deeper alternative might be, "What surprised you most after moving there?" Because surprise naturally encourages storytelling and personal reflection. I frequently teach students that emotionally rich words like surprised, challenged, inspired, or changed tend to unlock more meaningful conversations because they connect directly to memory and identity. During one workshop in California, I watched two strangers speak for nearly 40 minutes after one person simply asked, "What experience influenced your career decisions the most?" And I realized again how powerful carefully chosen questions can become. Language is not merely information exchange. It is emotional architecture shaping the direction and depth of human connection. Many learners also worry excessively about making mistakes during conversations, yet native speakers themselves constantly hesitate, restart sentences, and search for better words while speaking. I sometimes tell my students about my younger years when I worked briefly at a bookstore cafe in Portland during college because that job completely changed my understanding of communication. Customers rarely remembered whether conversations sounded grammatically perfect. Instead, they remembered how those interactions made them feel emotionally. One regular customer, an elderly painter with tired blue eyes, once spoke with me for almost 2 hours about loneliness after retirement, and afterward, he thanked me simply for listening carefully rather than interrupting constantly. That experience taught me a lesson far more valuable than advanced grammar rules. People forgive language imperfections surprisingly easily when warmth, curiosity, and attention remain present throughout the conversation. As we reach the end of this first lesson together, I want you to understand that mastering deep talk and ice-breaking is not about memorizing magical sentences that instantly make everyone like you. Real communication develops gradually through emotional awareness, thoughtful questioning, patient listening, and the courage to remain genuinely curious about other people's lives even when conversations initially feel uncomfortable. Every open-ended question you ask creates an opportunity for connection. Every filler expression gives your thoughts room to breathe naturally, and every moment of authentic attention builds trust stronger than perfect grammar ever could. In the next part of our journey, we will build upon this foundation by learning how to express personal opinions, debate ideas respectfully, and defend viewpoints with confidence while maintaining emotional balance during disagreements. Once you master the skill of opening conversations and breaking awkward silence, you will create a strong foundation that allows discussions to flow more naturally and prepares you for the next step, sharing and debating personal viewpoints. After spending years teaching students how to break awkward silence and build emotionally meaningful conversations, I eventually noticed another challenge appearing almost immediately afterward. Many learners could begin conversations comfortably, yet they became nervous the moment discussions turned into opinions, disagreement, or debate. I remember sitting inside a quiet cafe near the Chicago River one rainy evening with several advanced students when the topic of artificial intelligence suddenly emerged during casual conversation, and the emotional atmosphere shifted instantly because everyone feared saying something controversial or incorrect. One student from Italy whispered to me afterward that expressing opinions in English felt far more dangerous than simply making small talk because disagreement carried the risk of embarrassment, rejection, or misunderstanding. That moment reminded me of my own university years in America when I often avoided debates in classrooms because I mistakenly believed confident speakers were naturally born rather than carefully developed over time. In today's lesson, I want to guide you through the delicate art of expressing opinions clearly, disagreeing respectfully, and defending ideas intelligently while preserving emotional balance and human connection throughout the conversation. When I first started teaching communication workshops in Boston, I noticed that many international students confuse debate with conflict because in their minds disagreement automatically meant hostility or disrespect. American conversational culture, however, especially in universities and professional settings, often encourages respectful disagreement because people tend to value individuality and analytical thinking quite strongly. I once observed two professors discussing remote work policies during a conference lunch, and although their opinions differed completely, the conversation remained calm, curious, and intellectually stimulating rather than emotionally aggressive. One professor leaned back thoughtfully and said, "I see your point, but I think flexibility can sometimes reduce team cohesion," while the other nodded slowly before responding, "That's fair, although I'm in two minds about this because productivity also improves when employees feel trusted." Listening to them carefully, I realized that advanced communication is not about destroying opposing opinions. It is about exploring ideas without destroying emotional comfort between people. Many English learners unknowingly use language that sounds too absolute because they believe certainty automatically creates authority. However, native speakers frequently soften opinions to appear thoughtful and emotionally intelligent. Expressions such as, "I see your point," or "I understand where you're coming from," although create conversational bridges that protect the relationship while allowing disagreement to exist naturally. I remember coaching a talented engineer from South Korea who often sounded unintentionally aggressive during discussions because he used direct phrases like, "You are wrong," or "That makes no sense" whenever he disagreed with colleagues. During one practice exercise, I encouraged him to replace those statements with softer structures like, "I can understand that perspective, but I personally see the situation differently." And the emotional atmosphere transformed immediately because people stopped becoming defensive. Language is deeply connected to psychology, and the words we choose can either invite collaboration or quietly trigger emotional resistance, without us even realizing it. Several years ago, I attended a public discussion in New York about artificial intelligence and its growing influence on education, employment, and creativity, and the event became one of the most valuable communication lessons of my career. A young entrepreneur passionately argued that AI would eventually improve nearly every aspect of human productivity, while an older writer expressed concern that creativity and emotional depth might slowly disappear beneath automation. What fascinated me most was not their opposing opinions themselves, but the way they structured their arguments with calm confidence and logical progression instead of emotional chaos. The entrepreneur said, "Personally, I believe artificial intelligence can increase efficiency dramatically because repetitive tasks consume enormous amounts of human energy. For example, hospitals already use AI systems to organize medical records faster. Therefore, professionals can spend more time focusing on patients directly." Without realizing it at the time, I was listening to an excellent example of the PrEP formula, point, reason, example, point, a structure that creates clarity and persuasive rhythm during discussions. The PrEP formula became one of my favorite teaching tools because it helps learners organize thoughts clearly even during emotionally complicated conversations. I often explain it to students in simple terms. First, you state your opinion directly. Then you explain why you believe it. Afterward, you provide an example or experience supporting the idea. And finally, you reinforce the original point naturally. During one workshop in Seattle, I asked students to discuss work-life balance using the PrEP structure because modern professionals frequently struggle with exhaustion and emotional burnout. One student from Brazil began nervously by saying, "I think companies should allow more flexible schedules because constant pressure damages mental health. For instance, my older brother worked 12 hours daily for years and eventually developed severe anxiety. so I strongly believe balance improves both happiness and productivity. His grammar was not perfect, yet his argument sounded powerful because the structure carried emotional and logical momentum simultaneously. As discussions become deeper, another psychological difficulty often appears: the fear of being judged for personal opinions. I experienced this fear intensely during my own early teaching career because standing in front of classrooms filled with intelligent adults sometimes made me question whether my perspective sounded naive or simplistic. One evening after class, a student asked me whether social media was helping or damaging modern relationships, and although I had many thoughts, I hesitated momentarily because emotionally charged topics rarely have perfectly clear answers. Instead of pretending absolute certainty, I answered honestly by saying, I'm in two minds about this because social media helps people stay connected across distances, but it can also create unhealthy comparison and emotional loneliness. That sentence changed the direction of the entire conversation because students suddenly realized that intelligent communication does not always require black and white conclusions. Sometimes thoughtful uncertainty itself demonstrates maturity and emotional depth. A few months later, I organized a debate exercise for advanced learners in Chicago where students needed to discuss controversial topics while maintaining respectful emotional control regardless of disagreement. At first, the atmosphere felt tense because everyone feared confrontation. However, I encouraged them to treat discussions as collaborative exploration rather than intellectual combat. One student argued passionately that remote work improved quality of life, while another insisted office environments strengthened teamwork and creativity more effectively than digital communication ever could. Instead of interrupting aggressively, they practiced transitional phrases like, "That's an interesting perspective. I can partly agree with that. And from my experience, though, the situation feels slightly different." Watching their confidence grow reminded me that conversational fluency depends just as much on emotional flexibility as it does on grammar or vocabulary. I often tell students that persuasive communication resembles architecture because strong arguments require structure, emotional balance, and carefully connected ideas rather than random passionate statements. During one memorable lesson, I asked students to defend opinions about whether universities should rely more heavily on technology in classrooms, and many initially responded with vague emotional reactions instead of organized reasoning. A woman from Vietnam quietly surprised the entire class when she calmly said, "I believe technology can improve independent learning because students have access to information instantly. For example, online platforms allow people in rural areas to study subjects previously unavailable to them, so educational technology can reduce inequality when used responsibly." Her classmates immediately listened more attentively because her argument moved naturally from idea to explanation to evidence, without emotional confusion. That moment perfectly demonstrated how structure increases persuasive power even when the speaker uses relatively simple vocabulary. One important cultural observation I frequently share involves the American tendency to value confidence during discussions while simultaneously appreciating politeness and emotional restraint. In many workplaces across the United States, employees are expected to contribute opinions actively during meetings instead of remaining completely silent. However, direct aggression is usually viewed negatively because collaboration matters deeply in professional environments. I once coached a talented accountant from Japan who rarely spoke during group discussions because he feared making mistakes publicly, yet his silence unfortunately caused colleagues to assume he lacked ideas entirely. Together we practiced softer entry phrases such as, "From my perspective," or "One possible concern might be," because these expressions allowed him to participate without sounding overly forceful. Several months later, he told me proudly that his manager had complimented him for becoming more engaged and articulate during team conversations. Another fascinating aspect of debate involves listening carefully enough to recognize partial agreement instead of focusing exclusively on disagreement itself. Many inexperienced communicators behave as though discussions resemble battles where only one side can survive. However, mature conversations often contain shared ground hidden beneath surface differences. I remember having a long conversation with a journalist in Washington who strongly supported technological innovation while simultaneously worrying about its psychological impact on younger generations. At one point, she smiled thoughtfully and said, "Actually, I think both sides are focusing on different parts of the same problem," and her sentence instantly reduced tension because everyone suddenly recognized the complexity of the issue. Expressions like, "You make a good point," or "I agree with part of what you're saying," create emotional openness that keeps discussions productive instead of defensive. As our conversations throughout this lesson gradually become more analytical and intellectually demanding, I want you to understand that successful debate is not measured solely by whether people agree with you afterward. True communication success often means expressing your ideas clearly while preserving dignity, curiosity, and emotional respect for everyone involved in the discussion. Every time you use structures like, "I see your point," or organize thoughts through the prep formula, you train your mind to think more calmly and persuasively even under conversational pressure. In the next part of our shared journey, we will move naturally into the world of professional communication, workplace meetings, negotiation, and collaborative problem-solving where clarity, confidence, and emotional intelligence become even more essential. Knowing how to defend your opinions and debate respectfully not only helps you establish your personal value in discussions, but also becomes an important stepping stone toward professional communication, where accuracy and clarity matter even more. After guiding my students through the emotionally delicate world of expressing opinions and debating respectfully, I began noticing another transformation taking place inside many of them. They were no longer afraid to share ideas socially, yet professional environments still made them deeply anxious. I remember walking through downtown Chicago one icy morning on my way to teach a corporate communication workshop, when I suddenly realized how different workplace English truly feels compared to casual conversation because offices often demand precision, diplomacy, efficiency, and emotional control simultaneously. Several students had already confessed to me that they could speak comfortably with friends at cafes or parties, but the moment they entered meetings filled with managers, clients, or executives, their confidence collapsed almost instantly. That fear was understandable because workplace communication carries invisible pressure. Every sentence feels connected to reputation, competence, and opportunity in ways ordinary conversations usually are not. In today's lesson, I want to guide you into the world of business English, where communication becomes both strategic and human, requiring you to contribute ideas clearly, interrupt politely, negotiate carefully, and collaborate with emotional intelligence while maintaining professionalism at every stage. One of the first concepts I teach in professional communication is the elevator pitch because modern workplaces often demand the ability to introduce yourself and your ideas quickly without sounding robotic or overly rehearsed. Years ago, while attending a startup conference in San Francisco, I watched dozens of talented young professionals ruin potentially valuable opportunities simply because they either talked too much or became completely paralyzed when introducing themselves. I remember meeting a nervous software designer from India who stared at the floor awkwardly when an investor asked him what kind of projects he specialized in, and after several painful seconds, he muttered fragmented technical details that lacked emotional clarity entirely. Later that evening, I sat beside him in the hotel lobby and explained that strong elevator pitches are not about impressing people with complexity. They are about communicating value simply, confidently, and memorably within a very short amount of time. Together, we practiced a smoother introduction where he said, I design educational software that helps students learn mathematics more interactively because I believe technology should reduce fear instead of increasing it, and suddenly his personality and purpose became much more visible. What fascinated me over the years was how many professionals mistakenly believed sounding intelligent required long, complicated explanations filled with technical vocabulary and endless details. In reality, most successful communicators in American business culture value clarity more than verbal decoration because meetings move quickly and attention spans remain limited under pressure. I once attended a marketing strategy session in New York where one executive spent nearly 10 minutes explaining a relatively simple idea using confusing jargon, and by the end of his presentation, the entire room looked emotionally exhausted rather than inspired. Immediately afterward, another woman calmly summarized her proposal in less than 1 minute by saying, "Our goal is simple. We want customers to feel emotionally connected to the product before they compare prices." And the room instantly focused again because clarity creates psychological relief. That experience permanently reinforced my belief that concise communication often demonstrates deeper mastery than complicated speech ever could. Another challenge many English learners face during workplace discussions involves interruption because meetings rarely unfold in perfect calm order where every speaker receives uninterrupted attention. Early in my teaching career, I worked with an accountant from Brazil who constantly lost opportunities to contribute because he became completely silent whenever someone interrupted him accidentally. During practice meetings, I noticed that even when his ideas were excellent, he struggled to regain conversational control afterward because emotionally he interpreted interruptions as rejection instead of normal conversational movement. I taught him several polite recovery phrases such as, "If I could just finish my point," or "I'd like to return briefly to what I mentioned earlier," because these expressions allow speakers to reclaim attention without sounding aggressive or defensive. Watching his confidence gradually grow reminded me again that fluency is not simply about vocabulary knowledge. It is about learning how to navigate real human dynamics under pressure. Interrupting politely is another subtle but extremely important workplace skill because remaining silent forever can damage collaboration just as much as speaking too aggressively. I remember participating in a tense project meeting in Seattle where several team members desperately wanted to contribute ideas, yet one manager dominated the conversation so completely that nobody else could enter naturally. Finally, a young employee leaned forward carefully and said, "Sorry to interrupt, but I think there may be another angle worth considering," and her tone remained so calm and respectful that the conversation shifted immediately without emotional conflict. That moment became one of my favorite teaching examples because it demonstrated how emotional tone often matters more than the interruption itself. Expressions like, "Could I quickly add something here?" or "Before we move on, may I mention one concern?" soften conversational entry, while still allowing you to participate actively and professionally. As my workshops expanded across different American cities, I became increasingly aware that workplace communication is deeply connected to emotional perception because colleagues constantly interpret not only your words, but also your confidence, flexibility, and emotional awareness. I once coached a talented engineer from Germany who sounded unintentionally cold during meetings because his speech focused entirely on logic without emotional nuance or collaborative language. During one role-play exercise about task delegation, he told a teammate, "Finish this report by Friday," and although the sentence was grammatically correct, it created emotional distance because it sounded overly rigid. Together we transformed the statement into something more collaborative like, "Would you be able to handle this report before Friday? I think your experience with the previous project would really help," and the difference in emotional atmosphere became immediate. Professional English often depends less on grammatical perfection and more on understanding how language shapes relationships within teams. Several years ago, I was invited to observe a negotiation workshop in Boston involving professionals from multiple countries discussing fictional business partnerships and contract agreements. What fascinated me most was not the negotiation strategies themselves, but how emotional tension changed people's communication styles almost instantly. One participant became extremely direct whenever disagreements appeared, while another avoided disagreement entirely because she feared conflict so intensely that she accepted unfavorable terms simply to preserve harmony. After the exercise ended, I explained that successful negotiation requires balance between assertiveness and flexibility because workplaces reward people who can defend ideas without damaging long-term collaboration. I encouraged them to use phrases such as, "I understand your concerns," or "perhaps we can find a middle ground," because these expressions maintain emotional openness even during difficult discussions. Negotiation is rarely about defeating another person completely. It is usually about creating conditions where both sides feel respected enough to continue cooperating afterward. Conflict resolution became another essential topic in my lessons because every workplace eventually experiences misunderstandings, frustration, or emotional tension between colleagues. I remember consulting for a small publishing company in Chicago where two department managers had stopped communicating effectively after months of unresolved resentment regarding deadlines and responsibilities. During our first meeting together, the atmosphere felt painfully cold because both individuals focused more on defending themselves than understanding each other's perspectives. Instead of allowing accusations to dominate the conversation, I encouraged them to describe situations using calmer language such as, "I felt overwhelmed when deadlines changed unexpectedly," rather than emotionally explosive statements like, "You never communicate properly." Gradually, the emotional temperature lowered because softer phrasing created space for listening instead of immediate defensiveness, and eventually they began discussing solutions instead of repeating blame. Another area where professional communication becomes critically important involves task delegation because many managers and team leaders struggle to assign responsibilities clearly without sounding controlling or insensitive. During a leadership seminar in Los Angeles, one participant admitted that she often completed projects herself because delegating tasks made her feel guilty or demanding toward coworkers. I explained that healthy delegation is not about forcing work onto others unfairly. It is about creating trust, clarity, and efficiency within collaborative environments. We practiced useful expressions such as, "Could you take the lead on this?" Or, "I'd appreciate your help with this section because your analytical skills are particularly strong," since these structures combine authority with appreciation. People generally respond more positively when they feel their abilities are recognized instead of merely exploited for productivity. Throughout my years teaching professionals from different cultural backgrounds, I noticed that silence inside meetings can carry very different meanings depending on cultural expectations and personal psychology. In some environments, silence signals careful thinking and respect, while in others it may be interpreted as uncertainty, disengagement, or lack of preparation. I once coached a brilliant designer from Japan who constantly hesitated before contributing ideas because she worried her suggestions might sound imperfect or unnecessary compared to senior colleagues. During one exercise, I encouraged her to use softer entry phrases like, "One possibility we might consider is," because tentative structures allowed her to participate without feeling emotionally exposed or overly assertive. A few months later, she proudly told me that her manager had started inviting her opinions more frequently because her thoughtful contributions consistently improved team discussions. As workplace conversations become increasingly complex, emotional intelligence grows just as important as grammar, pronunciation, or professional vocabulary because businesses ultimately depend on human relationships rather than information alone. I still remember an executive in Washington telling me during a conference dinner, "People rarely remember every detail of your presentation, but they always remember how collaboration with you felt emotionally, and his words stayed with me for years afterward. Whether you are introducing yourself through an elevator pitch, negotiating project terms, resolving conflict, or reclaiming your turn after interruption, every interaction quietly shapes your professional identity in the minds of others. In the next lesson, we will move away from the formal structure of workplace communication and begin exploring storytelling, emotional narration, and the art of sharing experiences vividly enough to create deep emotional connection with listeners. Once you can smoothly handle formal and logical workplace communication, the next step is learning how to soften your communication style by adding emotional elements that help listeners understand and connect with you through storytelling. After helping my students navigate professional meetings, negotiations, and emotionally delicate workplace conversations, I began noticing that many of them still struggled with one deeply human skill that quietly influences nearly every successful communicator: the ability to tell stories that make listeners feel emotionally connected rather than merely informed. I remember leaving a business conference in Chicago one autumn evening when a senior executive stopped me near the hotel entrance and confessed that although his presentations were logically clear, people rarely remembered them afterward because they lacked emotional texture and personal depth. His comment stayed in my mind for weeks because it reflected something I had gradually discovered throughout my years teaching communication across America. Facts may inform people temporarily, but stories shape memory, emotion, and trust far more powerfully. Every meaningful conversation, negotiation, or persuasive discussion eventually depends on emotional resonance, because human beings naturally respond to experiences, struggles, surprises, and transformation more deeply than isolated information alone. In today's lesson, I want to guide you into the art of storytelling in English, where grammar, emotional pacing, vivid imagery, and carefully chosen transitions combine to transform ordinary experiences into unforgettable narratives that emotionally move listeners. I still remember one particular winter morning in New York when I was teaching an advanced communication class filled with international professionals who all possessed excellent grammar but sounded emotionally distant while speaking about their experiences. During one exercise, I asked a student from Spain to describe a memorable trip he had taken recently, and he responded with technically correct sentences like, "I went to Iceland and I saw beautiful mountains," yet the story felt emotionally flat because the listener could not feel atmosphere, tension, or personal emotion. I encouraged him to slow down and imagine the experience visually again before speaking, and after several quiet moments, he began differently by saying, "When I arrived in Iceland, the wind was howling so loudly that I could barely hear my own footsteps against the snow." Instantly, the classroom atmosphere changed because listeners were no longer receiving information alone. They were emotionally entering the scene itself. That moment perfectly demonstrated one of the most important truths about storytelling: vivid detail transforms language into emotional experience. One essential part of engaging storytelling involves mastering past tenses, because narratives rarely unfold through isolated actions alone. Instead, they move through layers of background events, interruptions, emotional turning points, and consequences unfolding over time. I often explain to students that the past simple tense acts like the main road of the story because it describes completed actions directly, while the past continuous creates atmosphere and movement around those actions. Several years ago, while teaching in Seattle, I shared a personal memory by saying, "I was walking through downtown during a heavy storm when suddenly the electricity went out across the entire neighborhood," and students immediately noticed how the past continuous prepared the emotional setting before the dramatic event arrived. The past perfect adds another emotional layer because it allows speakers to describe events that happened even earlier than the main timeline, creating depth and causality within the story itself. When I later added, "By the time I reached the cafe, the owner had already locked the doors because flooding had begun nearby," the narrative suddenly felt richer and more cinematic because listeners could sense the unfolding sequence of events more clearly. One evening after class, I sat alone beside Lake Michigan reflecting on why some people naturally captivate listeners while others lose attention almost immediately despite speaking grammatically well. Gradually, I realized that emotional transitions often function as invisible bridges guiding listeners through changing moods and developments within a narrative. Expressions like out of the blue, regrettably, to my surprise, or that was the turning point, may appear simple at first glance, yet psychologically they prepare the listener emotionally for what comes next. I once heard an elderly journalist describe losing his first reporting job by saying, "Everything seemed stable for months. Then out of the blue, the newspaper announced massive layoffs." And the phrase instantly created dramatic tension because listeners sensed unexpected disruption approaching. Emotional transitions are powerful because they organize feelings as much as they organize information, allowing stories to flow naturally while maintaining emotional momentum. As my teaching career continued, I became increasingly fascinated by sentence stress and vocal emphasis because storytelling depends not only on vocabulary and grammar, but also on rhythm, pacing, and emotional sound. During workshops in Boston, I often ask students to repeat the exact same sentence while changing which word received stress because meaning and emotional intensity shifted dramatically each time. For example, when someone says, "I never expected him to leave that night," stressing the word never creates shock, while stressing leave emphasizes emotional abandonment instead. I remember a quiet student from South Korea who once told a heartbreaking story about missing her grandfather's final phone call before he passed away, and although her grammar contained several mistakes, the emotional pauses and stress patterns in her voice made the entire room silent with empathy. That experience reminded me once again that storytelling is deeply human before it is grammatical, because emotional sincerity often reaches listeners more powerfully than technical perfection alone. Several years ago, I traveled briefly through a small mountain town in Colorado after finishing a teaching conference nearby, and that journey later became one of my favorite storytelling lessons for advanced students. I explained to them that a memorable narrative rarely begins with abstract explanation because listeners connect more naturally to scenes, sensations, and movement than generalized summaries. Instead of saying, "My trip was difficult," I described the experience more vividly by saying, "Snow was falling so heavily that I could barely see the narrow road twisting between the mountains, and my hands were trembling against the steering wheel as darkness slowly surrounded the valley." The emotional imagery immediately pulled listeners into the experience because sensory detail creates immersion rather than distant observation. Storytelling becomes powerful when listeners stop hearing words mechanically and begin mentally experiencing the scene alongside the speaker. Another important storytelling technique involves allowing emotional vulnerability to appear naturally instead of trying to sound constantly impressive or emotionally controlled. During one workshop in Los Angeles, a businessman described losing an important contract, yet his story felt emotionally disconnected because he focused entirely on statistics, schedules, and technical details without revealing any personal emotional reaction. I gently encouraged him to describe what he had actually felt during that experience, and after a long pause he admitted quietly, "Regrettably, I felt like I had disappointed everyone who trusted me." That single emotional sentence transformed the entire narrative because vulnerability created authenticity, and authenticity creates connection. Listeners rarely remember perfect factual accuracy for long periods of time. However, they often remember emotional honesty for years afterward. I also teach my students that effective storytelling requires balance because too many unnecessary details can exhaust listeners emotionally instead of engaging them. I remember attending a dinner party in Washington where one guest spent nearly 30 minutes describing a simple airport delay with endless irrelevant information about luggage colors, coffee prices, and seating arrangements until everyone around the table gradually stopped paying attention. Later that evening, another woman shared a much shorter story about missing her flight because she had stopped to help a frightened child who became separated from his parents inside the terminal, and suddenly the entire group listened carefully because the narrative contained emotional purpose and human stakes. Strong stories do not depend on quantity of detail alone. They depend on selecting details that support emotional movement and meaning. Every sentence should either deepen atmosphere, reveal personality, increase tension, or move the listener emotionally closer to the heart of the experience. Throughout my years teaching English across different cities in America, I noticed that storytelling often becomes the bridge between formal communication and genuine human connection because stories reveal personality more naturally than logical arguments alone. I once coached a lawyer in Chicago who struggled to persuade clients despite possessing impressive technical expertise because his explanations sounded emotionally cold and detached. During one session, I encouraged him to begin presentations with brief, personal stories illustrating why certain legal decisions mattered emotionally for real families and individuals rather than presenting abstract information immediately. Several months later, he told me clients had started responding far more positively because storytelling made complex ideas feel emotionally understandable instead of intimidating. Stories humanize communication by transforming information into lived experience, and that transformation creates trust more effectively than logic by itself ever could. As we reach the end of this lesson together, I want you to remember that storytelling is not merely entertainment. It is one of the oldest and most powerful forms of human connection ever created. Every time you describe a journey, a mistake, a surprising moment, or an emotional turning point, you invite listeners to experience life temporarily through your perspective and emotions. By mastering past tenses, emotional transitions, sensory detail, and sentence stress, you gradually learn how to shape ordinary experiences into narratives that feel vivid, meaningful, and emotionally alive. In the next part of our journey, we will build naturally upon these storytelling skills by learning how to persuade people more effectively, discuss difficult problems collaboratively, and guide conversations toward practical solutions without sounding overly aggressive or controlling. A compelling and well-structured story can emotionally resonate with listeners, creating strong connection and making it easier for you to guide them toward accepting your ideas or solutions afterward. After guiding my students through the emotional power of storytelling and helping them transform ordinary experiences into vivid narratives, I began noticing another important shift taking place inside many of them. They were becoming more emotionally expressive, yet they still struggled whenever conversations required persuasion, negotiation, or collaborative problem-solving. I remember leaving a communication seminar in Boston late one evening when a young entrepreneur approached me outside the conference hall and admitted that although he could explain his ideas clearly, he often failed to convince others to support them because his suggestions sounded too direct and emotionally rigid. His frustration immediately reminded me of something I had gradually learned throughout years of teaching communication across America. People rarely resist ideas alone. They often resist the emotional pressure attached to those ideas. In professional and personal conversations alike, persuasion becomes far more effective when listeners feel respected, included, and emotionally safe rather than controlled or cornered. In today's lesson, I want to guide you through the subtle art of persuasion and collaborative problem-solving in English, where indirect suggestions, emotional diplomacy, and conditional thinking help transform difficult discussions into opportunities for cooperation and creative solutions. One of the first things I teach students about persuasion is that direct commands frequently create invisible emotional resistance even when the idea itself is reasonable. Several years ago, I observed a project manager in Chicago become increasingly frustrated because her team kept ignoring suggestions she believed were perfectly logical and efficient. During meetings, she often used rigid statements such as, "We need to change this immediately," or, "You should follow this process instead." And although her intentions were good, the emotional tone unintentionally sounded controlling. Later, during a private coaching session, I encouraged her to soften her suggestions by using collaborative structures like, "Why don't we explore another option?" Or, "What if we tried adjusting the schedule slightly?" Because these phrases psychologically invite participation instead of imposing authority. The difference became remarkable within weeks because her colleagues stopped reacting defensively and started contributing ideas more openly, proving once again that emotional tone can shape outcomes just as strongly as logic itself. I still remember teaching a workshop in Seattle where a group of international employees needed to solve a fictional workplace crisis involving delayed deadlines, exhausted staff members, and communication breakdowns between departments. At first, the room felt tense because participants immediately began criticizing one another's ideas rather than building solutions collaboratively. One participant from Germany insisted, "This system is inefficient and needs to be replaced," while another from Brazil argued emotionally that the real issue involved poor leadership rather than technical structure. Instead of allowing the conversation to become confrontational, I gently interrupted and suggested that everyone reformulate their ideas using softer, collaborative phrases designed to reduce emotional pressure. Gradually, statements like, "Why don't we consider reorganizing responsibilities?" and "What if we tried shorter weekly meetings to reduce confusion?" began replacing accusations, and almost immediately the atmosphere shifted from defensive conflict toward constructive teamwork. Another essential part of persuasive communication involves learning how to discuss hypothetical possibilities intelligently through conditional sentences because real-life problem-solving often depends on imagining alternative outcomes, missed opportunities, or future consequences. I often explain to students that conditional structures are not merely grammar exercises buried inside textbooks. They are psychological tools allowing people to evaluate risks, regrets, and potential solutions with emotional nuance and intellectual flexibility. During one advanced lesson in New York, I asked students to imagine a company struggling financially after expanding too quickly into international markets, and together we explored how different conditional forms changed the emotional meaning of each statement. When someone said, "If the company reduced unnecessary expenses, it would recover more quickly," we were using the type 2 conditional to discuss a hypothetical present solution. Later, another student reflected regretfully, "If the managers had listened to customer feedback earlier, they would not have lost so many clients." And suddenly the conversation gained emotional depth because the type 3 conditional introduced hindsight, consequence, and regret into the discussion. One evening after class, I sat beside the Chicago River with a former student who had recently become a team leader inside a growing technology company, and she confessed that decision-making often felt emotionally exhausting because every possible solution seemed connected to potential risks and unintended consequences. I told her that advanced communication does not require pretending certainty exists in every situation because truly mature problem-solving often involves acknowledging complexity honestly. Together we practiced mixed conditionals by discussing hypothetical situations connected to career choices, personal regrets, and workplace dynamics. She quietly reflected, "If I had been more confident earlier in my career, I would probably be managing larger projects now." And that sentence beautifully demonstrated how past actions can continue influencing present realities emotionally and professionally. Mixed conditionals allow speakers to connect different timelines naturally, creating thoughtful discussions that sound reflective, intelligent, and emotionally layered rather than mechanically grammatical. As my workshops continued across different American cities, I became increasingly aware that persuasive communication depends heavily on emotional pacing because listeners need time to process ideas psychologically before accepting them fully. I once observed a marketing executive in Los Angeles completely overwhelm his colleagues during a meeting because he presented too many aggressive proposals too quickly without inviting discussion or emotional participation. Afterward, one exhausted employee whispered to me privately, "It feels like he's trying to win an argument instead of solve a problem." And that sentence stayed with me because it captured a critical truth about collaboration. Persuasion becomes far more effective when people feel they are helping create solutions rather than simply obeying instructions designed by someone else. Expressions like "perhaps we could" or "one possibility might be" soften conversational energy enough to encourage exploration instead of resistance. Several years ago, I attended a leadership conference in Washington where professionals from different industries discussed how companies should respond to rapidly changing workplace expectations after the rise of remote work culture. One speaker argued passionately that employees should return to offices permanently because face-to-face collaboration improved creativity and accountability, while another insisted flexibility was essential for modern mental health and work-life balance. What fascinated me most was not the disagreement itself, but how the most persuasive participants acknowledged both advantages and disadvantages calmly instead of defending only one perspective blindly. A woman sitting near me explained thoughtfully, "If companies forced everyone back into offices immediately, many talented employees might leave. However, if teams never met in person, collaboration could weaken over time." Her balanced reasoning sounded intelligent precisely because she weighed consequences carefully instead of oversimplifying the issue emotionally. I often tell students that collaborative problem-solving resembles building a bridge because every participant contributes pieces gradually, and progress depends on emotional trust just as much as intellectual ability. During one workshop in San Francisco, I asked students to solve a fictional conflict involving declining customer satisfaction inside a restaurant chain struggling with staff shortages and poor online reviews. At first, several participants focused exclusively on criticizing management mistakes. However, I encouraged them to redirect energy toward constructive possibilities by asking solution-oriented questions such as, "What if we improved employee training gradually instead of changing everything immediately?" Or, "Why don't we gather customer feedback more consistently before redesigning the service process?" Slowly, the atmosphere became more cooperative because emotionally supportive language creates momentum rather than paralysis. Effective persuasion is rarely about dominating conversations completely. It is about guiding people gently towards shared understanding and practical action. Another deeply important aspect of persuasive communication involves understanding that emotions often influence decisions more strongly than logic alone, even inside professional environments where people claim objectivity matters most. I remember consulting briefly for a publishing company in New York where management could not understand why employees resisted a technically efficient scheduling system designed to improve productivity. On paper, the new process appeared completely rational. However, workers privately feared losing flexibility, autonomy, and emotional balance in their daily routines. During a staff meeting, I encouraged managers to stop presenting statistics alone and instead acknowledge emotional concerns directly by saying things like, "We understand this transition may feel stressful at first," because emotional validation often reduces resistance more effectively than endless logical explanation. Gradually, employees became more cooperative because they finally felt heard rather than managed like mechanical parts inside a system. Throughout my years teaching communication, I also noticed that many learners become excessively afraid of proposing imperfect solutions because they mistakenly believe persuasion requires flawless certainty and immediate success. In reality, Experienced communicators often present ideas tentatively because collaboration thrives when people remain flexible enough to adjust plans as new information appears. I once coached a university student preparing for a business competition in Boston, and although her ideas were innovative, she spoke so cautiously that judges struggled to understand her confidence level. Together we practiced combining diplomatic language with clearer conviction through phrases like, "I believe this approach could significantly improve customer engagement," because persuasive communication requires balancing openness with direction. Gradually, she learned that sounding collaborative does not mean sounding weak. Instead, it means creating space where ideas can evolve productively through discussion and refinement. As we reach the end of this lesson together, I want you to remember that persuasion is not manipulation, nor is problem-solving simply about proving your intelligence more forcefully than everyone else around you. True collaborative communication depends on emotional awareness, flexible thinking, respectful suggestion, and the ability to imagine possibilities beyond immediate frustration or disagreement. By learning indirect suggestion structures like, "Why don't we?" and mastering conditional sentences that explore hypothetical outcomes thoughtfully, you gradually develop the ability to guide conversations toward practical solutions while preserving emotional trust and cooperation. In the next lesson, we will move naturally into one of the most emotionally challenging areas of communication, handling complaints, apologizing sincerely, and responding calmly when misunderstandings, mistakes, or unexpected problems arise in real-life situations. However, discussions and problem-solving do not always go smoothly. There will be moments when mistakes or unexpected issues arise, requiring you to know how to face and handle difficult situations calmly. After helping my students learn how to persuade others gently and collaborate toward solutions without creating unnecessary emotional resistance, I began noticing another important challenge appearing naturally in their communication journeys. Many of them still struggled whenever situations became emotionally uncomfortable, especially during complaints, misunderstandings, or personal mistakes. I remember standing inside a crowded airport in Denver several years ago when a delayed flight caused tension to spread rapidly among exhausted travelers waiting near the departure gate. One passenger began shouting angrily at an airline employee whose face slowly tightened with visible stress, while another traveler approached the same employee calmly and said, "I understand the situation is difficult, but there seems to be a misunderstanding about my reservation," and the emotional outcome became completely different within seconds. That moment stayed with me because it perfectly demonstrated how emotional control and diplomatic language can transform conflict into cooperation even during frustrating circumstances. In today's lesson, I want to guide you through the delicate art of handling complaints, calming emotional tension, and offering sincere apologies in English while preserving dignity, emotional balance, and human connection on both sides of the conversation. Throughout my years teaching communication across America, I noticed that many English learners mistakenly believed complaints must sound forceful in order to be taken seriously. However, aggressive language often creates emotional defensiveness instead of practical solutions. I once coached a businessman from Italy who became extremely frustrated during a hotel stay in Chicago because his room reservation had disappeared unexpectedly after a long international flight. When he approached the front desk, his exhaustion transformed into anger almost immediately, and he began saying things like, "This is unacceptable," and "Your staff completely ruined my evening," which caused the employee to become nervous and emotionally guarded. Later, after the situation finally calmed down, we discussed how different the interaction might have felt if he had used softer complaint structures such as, "I'm afraid there may have been a mistake with my booking," or "There seems to be a misunderstanding regarding my reservation." Diplomatic language does not weaken your complaint. Instead, it reduces emotional tension enough for both sides to focus on solving the actual problem rather than defending themselves psychologically. One of the most valuable lessons I ever learned about complaints came from an elderly restaurant owner in New York who once told me, "People usually remember how you made them feel during problems more than how you treated them when everything was easy." His words stayed with me because emotionally difficult moments often reveal communication skills more honestly than comfortable situations ever can. Several years later, while teaching a workshop in Seattle, I asked students to role-play customer service conflicts involving delayed orders, incorrect payments, and scheduling mistakes. At first, many participants sounded either too passive or too aggressive because emotional discomfort pushed them toward extremes instead of balanced communication. Gradually, we practiced calmer structures such as, "I was wondering if you could help me understand what happened," or "I appreciate your effort, but I'm still concerned about this issue." And the atmosphere shifted noticeably because emotionally respectful language encourages cooperation instead of confrontation. I also teach my students that effective complaints depend heavily on emotional pacing because angry people often speak too quickly, interrupt constantly, or exaggerate situations in ways that reduce clarity and credibility. I remember visiting a crowded cafe in Boston one rainy afternoon when a customer became furious after receiving the wrong order twice in a row, and although her frustration was understandable, her rapid emotional speech made communication increasingly chaotic. The exhausted cashier eventually looked overwhelmed and confused because the conversation had transformed into emotional release instead of problem-solving dialogue. Later, during a classroom discussion, I explained that slowing down slightly while using calm transitional phrases like, "the issue is," or "what concerns me most is," allows listeners to process information more clearly without becoming emotionally defensive. Communication during conflict is not simply about expressing emotion honestly. It is also about maintaining enough clarity for practical resolution to remain possible. Several years ago, I experienced one of the most personally embarrassing moments of my teaching career when I accidentally sent confidential workshop notes to the wrong corporate client before an important training event in Los Angeles. The mistake happened late at night after several exhausting days of travel, and the moment I realized what I had done, I felt a wave of panic and shame move through my entire body. My first instinct was to explain the situation defensively and protect my professional image. However, experience had already taught me that sincere apologies require responsibility rather than emotional self-protection. Instead of making excuses, I contacted the client immediately and said, "I sincerely apologize for my mistake. I understand this may have caused confusion and inconvenience, and I'm already taking steps to correct the situation as quickly as possible." To my surprise, the client responded calmly and respectfully because genuine accountability often reduces anger more effectively than defensive explanation ever could. One essential difference I often explain to students involves the contrast between superficial apologies and emotionally sincere apologies because listeners instinctively recognize whether regret feels authentic or merely strategic. Expressions such as, "I'm sorry if you were upset," frequently sound emotionally distant because they avoid fully acknowledging responsibility for the situation itself. During one workshop in Chicago, a student apologized to a colleague by saying, "I'm sorry you misunderstood my message," and the entire room immediately sensed emotional tension increasing because the apology subtly blamed the other person instead of accepting accountability. Together we practiced stronger alternatives such as, "I'm sorry my message was unclear," or "I should have communicated more carefully," because sincere apologies focus on personal responsibility rather than emotional escape. Psychological honesty often matters more than perfect grammar during emotionally sensitive conversations. As my teaching career continued, I became increasingly fascinated by how emotional tone influences not only complaints and apologies, but also responses to criticism from others. I once observed a department manager in Washington react defensively during a meeting after an employee complained about unrealistic deadlines and communication confusion within the team. Instead of listening calmly, the manager immediately began explaining why the criticism was unfair, and within minutes the atmosphere became emotionally hostile because nobody felt heard anymore. Later, during a private leadership session, I encouraged him to begin difficult conversations with calming phrases like, "I understand why you feel frustrated," or "Thank you for bringing this to my attention," because emotional acknowledgement reduces tension before practical discussion even begins. People usually calm down faster when they sense their emotions are being recognized rather than dismissed or challenged. One evening after class, I sat with several students beside Lake Michigan discussing why misunderstandings between people often escalate so quickly even when neither side originally intended harm. A woman from South Korea quietly observed that many conflicts become worse because people focus more on defending pride than solving the actual issue, and her insight immediately reminded me of countless emotionally exhausting conversations I had witnessed throughout my career. Communication during difficult moments requires humility because emotionally intelligent people understand that preserving relationships often matters more than proving absolute correctness. We practiced phrases like, "Perhaps I misunderstood your intention," and "I think we may have interpreted the situation differently," because these structures reduce blame while keeping conversations open enough for clarification and repair. Diplomacy is not dishonesty. It is emotional strategy designed to protect communication from collapsing entirely. Another important area where tactful communication becomes essential involves workplace mistakes because professional environments often create intense pressure surrounding reputation and competence. I remember coaching a young engineer in San Francisco who accidentally deleted important project data before a major presentation and became terrified of admitting the mistake to her supervisor. Her first instinct was to hide the situation temporarily and hope nobody noticed. However, I explained that delayed honesty usually increases emotional damage far more severely over time. Together we practiced a calm and accountable explanation where she said, "I need to let you know about a mistake I made earlier today, and I'm already working on possible solutions to minimize the impact." Although the conversation remained uncomfortable, her supervisor appreciated the honesty and collaborative attitude because accountability combined with solution-focused thinking often restores trust more effectively than perfection itself. Throughout my years teaching communication, I also noticed that emotionally difficult situations frequently become unexpected opportunities for deeper human understanding when handled thoughtfully and sincerely. I once missed an important dinner meeting in New York because heavy traffic completely blocked the highway during a severe snowstorm, and by the time I finally arrived, I expected irritation and disappointment from the people waiting inside the restaurant. Instead of making excuses immediately, I apologized sincerely, explained the situation calmly, and acknowledged the inconvenience my delay had caused everyone else. To my surprise, the atmosphere softened quickly because emotional honesty creates connection even during unpleasant circumstances. Human beings rarely expect flawless behavior constantly. However, they deeply value sincerity, accountability, and respectful communication during difficult moments. As we reach the end of this lesson together, I want you to remember that communication skills become truly meaningful not during easy conversations, but during emotionally uncomfortable situations where frustration, disappointment, or embarrassment threaten to damage understanding between people. By learning diplomatic complaint language, such as "there seems to be a misunderstanding," practicing calm responses to criticism, and offering sincere apologies rooted in responsibility rather than defensiveness, you gradually develop emotional resilience alongside linguistic fluency. Difficult conversations will always remain part of human life because mistakes, misunderstandings, and unexpected problems are unavoidable wherever people interact closely. In the next part of our shared journey, we will move beyond conflict and emotional tension into the exciting world of travel, cultural exploration, and adapting communication styles while experiencing unfamiliar places, traditions, and perspectives across the world. Resolving conflicts and complaints successfully helps restore your confidence and relieve emotional pressure, preparing you to embrace new experiences, especially when exploring the outside world. After helping my students learn how to navigate emotionally difficult situations through tactful complaints, calm apologies, and respectful conflict resolution, I noticed that many of them gradually became more confident about stepping beyond familiar environments and exploring the world itself. I remember standing inside O'Hare International Airport in Chicago one bright spring morning while watching travelers rush past giant departure screens glowing with destinations from every corner of the world, and suddenly I realized how deeply communication and travel are connected to one another. Every airport, hotel lobby, crowded train station, or unfamiliar street corner becomes a living classroom where language stops being theoretical and transforms into survival, curiosity, adaptation, and human connection. Throughout my years teaching communication across America, I repeatedly discovered that students who traveled abroad often developed emotional flexibility and conversational confidence much faster than those who remained trapped inside textbook exercises alone. In today's lesson, I want to guide you through the language of travel, cultural exploration, and culture shock while sharing the emotional and practical communication skills necessary to navigate unfamiliar places with confidence, curiosity, and respect. Several years ago, I traveled to London to attend an international education conference, and despite being a native English speaker myself, I was immediately reminded that communication changes dramatically depending on culture, rhythm, tone, and social expectations. After landing at Heathrow Airport following an exhausting overnight flight, I approached the immigration counter feeling mentally drained and emotionally disconnected from time itself because jet lag has a strange ability to make every conversation feel slightly unreal. The immigration officer asked politely, "What brings you to the United Kingdom today?" And although the question sounded simple, I noticed how calm tone, eye contact, and concise answers carried enormous importance in that formal environment. Travel situations often require direct but polite communication because airports, hotels, and transportation systems depend on clarity under pressure. Expressions such as, "I'm here for a conference," "Could you tell me where the baggage claim area is?" or "I'm afraid my luggage hasn't arrived yet," become emotionally valuable because they allow travelers to remain calm while solving practical problems efficiently. I still remember one particularly stressful experience in New York several years before that London trip, when my connecting flight to Seattle was suddenly delayed because of severe weather moving across the Midwest. The departure board kept flashing new times every 30 minutes while frustrated passengers gathered around airline staff demanding answers with increasingly emotional voices. Instead of panicking immediately, I approached the service desk calmly and said, "Excuse me, I was wondering whether there are any alternative flights available tonight," because emotionally controlled language often produces better assistance during chaotic situations. The exhausted employee looked relieved by the respectful tone and spent several extra minutes helping me search for solutions while explaining possible hotel arrangements and rebooking procedures. Travel vocabulary connected to delays, cancellations, and transportation problems becomes essential because stressful situations often require quick thinking combined with emotional patience. Another unforgettable moment happened during a teaching trip to Toronto when my suitcase disappeared completely after landing, forcing me to navigate one of the most frustrating travel situations imaginable. I stood near the silent baggage carousel long after most passengers had already left the airport, watching the empty belt continue moving in endless circles while anxiety slowly tightened inside my chest. Eventually, I approached the airline counter and explained carefully, "I believe my luggage may have been misplaced because it never arrived on the carousel," and the employee immediately began checking tracking information while asking detailed questions about the suitcase's appearance. During moments like these, descriptive vocabulary becomes surprisingly important because travelers often need to explain colors, sizes, brands, and personal belongings clearly under emotional pressure. I described the suitcase as a medium-sized dark blue case with a silver handle and a small red ribbon attached near the zipper, and thankfully the detailed description helped airport staff locate it several hours later in another terminal. As my travels expanded across different countries and cities, I became increasingly fascinated by the subtle communication differences hidden inside ordinary interactions, such as asking for directions or ordering food. One afternoon in Tokyo, I became completely lost while trying to locate a small bookstore recommended by a colleague, and despite having a map in my hands, the endless maze of narrow streets felt overwhelming and disorienting. I finally approached an elderly shop owner and asked politely, "Excuse me, could you tell me how to get to this address?" While showing him the paper map, trembling slightly between my fingers. What surprised me most was not simply his kindness, but the careful politeness and patience embedded naturally within the conversation itself, because cultural expectations influence communication styles profoundly. Travel teaches you quickly that words alone are never enough. Tone, body language, facial expressions, and emotional sensitivity all shape understanding across cultures. Food also became one of the most emotionally powerful parts of my travels because describing flavors and dining experiences requires vocabulary far more vivid and sensory than ordinary daily conversation. I remember sitting inside a tiny family-owned restaurant in Mexico City one humid summer evening while tasting mole sauce for the very first time, and the flavor felt almost impossible to describe because it combined bitterness, sweetness, spice, and smoky richness simultaneously. Instead of relying on vague words like good or interesting, I began practicing more detailed sensory descriptions such as earthy, creamy, tangy, savory, or slightly bitter with a smoky aftertaste. Learning food vocabulary helped me communicate experiences more vividly, while also creating stronger emotional connections with local people who often felt proud sharing culinary traditions from their culture. Meals became conversations rather than transactions because language allowed curiosity and appreciation to replace distance and awkwardness. One evening in Istanbul, I sat drinking strong black tea beside a group of local university students who invited me into their conversation after noticing my hesitant attempts to pronounce Turkish menu items correctly. Although our shared language abilities remained imperfect, the emotional warmth of the interaction gradually dissolved nervousness on both sides. We discussed differences between American and Turkish social customs, family traditions, and attitudes toward hospitality while laughing about the misunderstandings travelers often experience abroad. At one point, a student smiled and asked me whether I had experienced culture shock yet, and I realized immediately how emotionally complicated that concept truly is. Culture shock rarely arrives dramatically all at once. Instead, it appears gradually through small moments of confusion, loneliness, fascination, homesickness, or emotional disorientation as familiar social rules quietly disappear around you. Throughout my years traveling and teaching internationally, I noticed that adaptation depends less on perfect language ability and more on emotional flexibility, curiosity, and willingness to tolerate temporary discomfort. I once taught a communication workshop in Berlin where several participants admitted they felt exhausted constantly because living abroad forced them to think carefully about every social interaction instead of relying on automatic cultural instincts developed since childhood. One participant explained quietly, "Even simple conversations feel mentally tiring because I'm always worried about behaving incorrectly, and I understood that feeling deeply because unfamiliar environments require continuous emotional adjustment." Travel vocabulary connected to uncertainty becomes important in these situations because phrases like, "I'm still getting used to things here," or "I'm trying to adapt to the local customs," help express vulnerability naturally without shame. Communication abroad often becomes less about perfection and more about patience with yourself during periods of transition. I also discovered that many cultural misunderstandings happen not because people are rude intentionally, but because social expectations differ invisibly across countries and communities. During a visit to France, I accidentally offended a cafe employee by ordering too abruptly without beginning the interaction politely enough, and although the mistake seemed small, the emotional atmosphere shifted immediately. Later, a local friend explained that greetings carry enormous cultural importance there because beginning interactions too directly can feel cold or disrespectful regardless of intention. Experiences like that taught me how deeply communication reflects cultural values hidden beneath vocabulary and grammar. Travel forces people to recognize that language is inseparable from human behavior, emotional norms, and collective social habits developed over generations. As I continued guiding students through communication lessons connected to travel and cultural exploration, I noticed something emotionally beautiful beginning to happen inside many of them. Fear gradually transformed into curiosity. Students who once hesitated to speak English publicly started describing dreams of visiting foreign cities, meeting international friends, or exploring unfamiliar traditions without panic dominating their thoughts completely. I often reminded them that mistakes abroad are not signs of failure because even native speakers experience confusion and misunderstanding constantly while traveling through unfamiliar environments. What matters most is maintaining emotional openness, adaptability, and willingness to keep communicating despite occasional discomfort or embarrassment. Every interaction inside airports, restaurants, taxis, train stations, or crowded markets becomes another opportunity to strengthen not only language ability, but also empathy, confidence, and global understanding. As we reach the end of this lesson together, I want you to remember that travel changes communication in ways textbooks alone rarely can because real-world interaction forces language to become emotionally alive, flexible, and deeply human. Whether you are checking into hotels, asking for directions, handling delayed flights, describing food flavors, or navigating the emotional confusion of culture shock, every experience teaches you something valuable about both language and yourself. The world becomes less intimidating when communication evolves beyond memorized grammar into genuine curiosity, adaptability, and emotional connection with people whose lives may initially seem very different from your own. In the next lesson, we will move naturally from travel communication into the world of everyday English, slang, idioms, and the informal expressions native speakers use constantly in real-life conversations outside formal classrooms and professional environments. The more you travel and experience different cultures, the more you realize that textbook English alone is not enough. To communicate naturally like native speakers, you need to integrate the language of real life into your communication skills. After guiding my students through airports, foreign cities, cultural misunderstandings, and emotionally transformative travel experiences, I began noticing another important shift in their communication abilities. They were becoming more confident speaking English formally, yet many still sounded strangely distant from the way native speakers actually communicate in everyday life. I remember sitting inside a crowded diner in Brooklyn one rainy evening while listening to several local friends speak casually with one another, and I suddenly realized how different real spoken English sounds compared to the carefully structured language found inside textbooks and academic classrooms. Native speakers constantly shorten expressions, interrupt themselves, use phrasal verbs instinctively, and fill conversations with idioms carrying emotional meanings that literal translations rarely explain properly. Several of my international students later admitted that they could understand business meetings or written articles relatively well, yet ordinary conversations between native speakers still felt confusing and emotionally exhausting because informal English moves quickly and unpredictably. In today's lesson, I want to guide you into the world of everyday English, slang, phrasal verbs, and idiomatic expressions so your communication can gradually sound more natural, emotionally connected, and authentically alive during real conversations with native speakers. One of the first things I explain to students is that phrasal verbs are absolutely everywhere in spoken English because native speakers rely on them almost unconsciously during daily communication. Several years ago, while teaching in Los Angeles, I asked a student to describe her morning routine, and she carefully used formal textbook verbs like awaken, consume breakfast, and depart from my apartment, which sounded grammatically impressive yet emotionally unnatural in casual conversation. Together we transformed those phrases into more conversational English by using expressions like wake up, grab breakfast, and head out, and immediately her speech began sounding warmer and more natural. Phrasal verbs matter because they reflect the rhythm of everyday interaction rather than the rigid structure of formal writing. When native speakers say things like, I ran into an old friend, I need to figure this out, or let's calm down for a minute, they're not consciously simplifying language. They're simply speaking the emotionally efficient English that developed naturally through daily life. I still remember one afternoon in Chicago when a student from South Korea became deeply frustrated during a cafe conversation because she understood every individual word spoken by the waiter, yet completely misunderstood the overall meaning of the sentence. Your order should come out pretty soon. She later admitted that the phrasal verb come out confused her because she expected language to behave more literally and predictably. That experience reminded me how emotionally discouraging informal English can initially feel for learners because spoken language rarely follows textbook logic perfectly. Over time, I encourage students to stop memorizing phrasal verbs mechanically and instead connect them emotionally to real situations and experiences. Expressions like turn down an offer, pick up a new skill, or get over disappointment become easier to remember when attached to emotional context rather than isolated vocabulary lists. Another fascinating aspect of everyday English involves idioms, because idiomatic expressions often reveal cultural attitudes, humor, emotional habits, and shared experiences hidden inside the language itself. I once heard a colleague in New York sigh heavily after an exhausting 12-hour meeting and say, "Let's just call it a day." And one of my international students looked genuinely confused because she imagined someone literally making a telephone call. Later I explained that call it a day simply means deciding to stop working or end an activity after reaching emotional or physical exhaustion. Idioms are powerful because their meanings extend beyond literal definitions and carry emotional atmosphere alongside practical meaning. Expressions such as bite the bullet, meaning to face something unpleasant bravely, or under the weather, meaning slightly sick or emotionally unwell, add color and emotional texture to conversations in ways direct explanations sometimes cannot achieve. Several years ago, while visiting Seattle during a particularly cold winter, I spent time with a group of local writers who constantly used informal expressions and conversational shortcuts that rarely appear in academic English lessons. One evening, after a long discussion about publishing frustrations and creative burnout, one writer laughed softly and said, "Honestly, I've just been feeling under the weather lately," and although she physically looked healthy, the phrase communicated emotional fatigue gently and naturally. Spoken English often prioritizes emotional comfort and rhythm over strict precision because people use language not only to exchange information, but also to maintain connection and emotional balance during conversation. I encouraged my students later to pay attention not merely to vocabulary definitions, but also to emotional tone and social context whenever learning idioms or slang. Informal expressions become meaningful only when understood as living emotional tools rather than decorative vocabulary items. As my teaching career continued across different American cities, I became increasingly fascinated by the enormous gap separating spoken English from written English because many learners mistakenly assume both forms follow identical patterns and expectations. I remember reviewing a student's email in Boston where he wrote, "Hey professor, gonna send you the files later," which sounded perfectly natural in casual speech, but emotionally inappropriate inside professional written communication. Together we discussed how spoken English often contains contractions, reduced pronunciation, filler sounds, unfinished sentences, and relaxed grammar structures that feel completely acceptable during conversation but awkward or unprofessional in formal writing. Native speakers naturally adjust their communication depending on context because language shifts constantly between emotional intimacy and professional clarity. Understanding when to sound relaxed and when to sound polished becomes one of the most important skills for advanced communicators. One unforgettable moment happened during a workshop in San Francisco when a student from Brazil finally understood why native speakers sometimes seemed emotionally distant despite technically friendly conversations. He explained that when Americans casually say, "We should hang out sometime," he initially interpreted the statement as a serious invitation requiring immediate planning. However, repeated experiences taught him that the phrase often functions as polite friendliness rather than concrete commitment. Spoken English contains countless socially indirect expressions designed more to maintain emotional comfort than communicate literal intention precisely. I explained that understanding these subtle cultural patterns requires listening not only to vocabulary, but also to tone, context, and relationship dynamics. Real communication depends heavily on emotional interpretation because people rarely say exactly what they mean in purely literal ways all the time. Another important part of sounding natural involves learning conversational fillers because native speakers constantly use small phrases to create thinking time, soften statements, or maintain conversational rhythm without awkward silence. During a class in Washington, I asked students to listen carefully to authentic cafe conversations recorded with permission from local volunteers, and they immediately noticed expressions like, kind of, actually, I mean, and to be honest, appearing everywhere. These fillers often carry little direct informational value. However, emotionally, they help conversations feel smoother, warmer, and less robotic. One student laughed after realizing that native speakers frequently interrupt themselves, restart sentences halfway through, or change direction while speaking casually. Spoken English feels alive precisely because it allows imperfection and emotional spontaneity instead of demanding constant grammatical perfection. I also teach students that slang should be approached carefully because informal expressions change rapidly depending on generation, region, social group, and cultural trends. Several years ago, I heard a teenager in Los Angeles describe a concert as totally lit, and later another student proudly repeated the expression during a professional networking event without realizing how informal and context-dependent it sounded. Slang creates emotional belonging within certain communities. However, using it incorrectly or excessively can sometimes sound forced or unnatural. Instead of encouraging students to imitate every trendy phrase immediately, I advise them to focus first on understanding common conversational patterns and emotionally neutral idioms widely recognized across different situations. Natural communication grows gradually through observation, listening, and genuine interaction rather than aggressive imitation alone. Throughout my years teaching communication, I noticed that students who became comfortable with everyday English also developed stronger listening abilities because they stopped expecting conversations to follow rigid textbook structures perfectly. Real spoken language contains interruptions, emotional reactions, unfinished thoughts, and subtle social meanings hidden beneath vocabulary itself. I remember sitting inside a crowded subway car in New York listening to strangers casually discussing work stress, family arguments, weather changes, and weekend plans using language that sounded messy yet emotionally expressive at the same time. None of them spoke in perfect textbook sentences, yet their communication felt deeply human, emotionally responsive, and socially effective. Fluency ultimately depends less on sounding academically impressive and more on understanding how real people naturally connect through language during ordinary moments of life. As we reach the end of this lesson together, I want you to remember that mastering everyday English is not about abandoning grammar or formal communication skills entirely. Instead, it is about expanding your emotional flexibility so you can move naturally between professional precision and relaxed human interaction. By learning phrasal verbs, understanding idioms like call it a day, bite the bullet, and under the weather, while recognizing the differences between spoken and written English, you gradually begin sounding less like someone translating mentally and more like someone genuinely living inside the language itself. In the next lesson, we will continue building upon this emotional naturalness by exploring how to give advice, comfort others, and respond empathetically during emotionally sensitive conversations where listening becomes just as important as speaking. Mastering everyday language helps eliminate communication barriers and creates a stronger sense of connection, allowing you to listen more effectively, understand others deeply, and offer thoughtful advice in conversations. After guiding my students through the emotionally rich world of everyday English, idioms, and natural conversation patterns, I began noticing another important transformation quietly taking place inside many of them. They were no longer afraid of speaking casually with native speakers, yet they still struggled deeply whenever conversations became emotionally sensitive or personally painful. I remember sitting inside a quiet cafe in Seattle one gray winter afternoon while listening to two friends speaking softly at the table beside me, and what fascinated me was not the grammar they used, but the emotional care hidden inside their words. One woman had recently lost her job and spoke with visible exhaustion in her voice, while the other listened patiently before saying, "I can imagine how hard it must be for you right now." And the entire emotional atmosphere shifted because empathy entered the conversation naturally. That moment reminded me once again that communication is not only about expressing ourselves clearly, but also about making other people feel emotionally understood during difficult moments. In today's lesson, I want to guide you through the language of empathy, emotional support, encouragement, and thoughtful advice so you can become not only a stronger speaker, but also a more compassionate listener capable of building trust and emotional connection through language. Throughout my years teaching communication across America, I discovered that many English learners focus intensely on speaking fluently while forgetting that meaningful conversations often depend more heavily on listening carefully and responding emotionally rather than dominating discussions constantly. Several years ago, during a workshop in Chicago, I asked students to practice comforting a friend experiencing emotional burnout after months of exhausting work pressure. At first, many participants immediately started offering solutions without fully acknowledging the person's emotions, saying things like, "You should quit your job," or "You need a vacation," which sounded practical but emotionally rushed. I explained gently that people experiencing emotional pain usually want understanding before advice, because empathy creates psychological safety first. Expressions such as, "That sounds incredibly stressful," or "I'm really sorry you're going through this," allow listeners to feel emotionally recognized before conversations move toward possible solutions or encouragement. I still remember a former student from Brazil who once told me about a painful breakup that left him emotionally devastated for months while studying abroad in New York. During one private conversation after class, he admitted that what hurt most was not the breakup itself, but the feeling that nobody truly listened to him afterward because everyone immediately tried to fix his emotions instead of simply understanding them. His words stayed with me because they revealed something deeply important about supportive communication. Emotional presence often matters more than immediate problem solving. I encouraged him later to practice empathetic expressions himself while supporting friends facing difficulties, using phrases like, "I can understand why you'd feel overwhelmed," or "anyone in your situation would probably feel exhausted too." Empathy becomes powerful because it reduces emotional isolation, allowing people to feel less alone inside their struggles. Another important lesson I often teach involves the difference between direct advice and supportive suggestion because overly forceful advice can unintentionally create emotional pressure or resistance, even when intentions are genuinely kind. Several years ago, I observed two colleagues in Boston discussing career frustrations during lunch, and one person kept saying things like, "You need to leave immediately," and "You have to stop tolerating that environment," while the other looked increasingly uncomfortable and emotionally defensive. Later, during a classroom discussion, I explained that softer advice structures usually sound more respectful and emotionally supportive because they preserve the listener's sense of autonomy. Expressions such as, "If I were in your shoes, I would probably take some time to reflect before making a decision," or "You might want to consider discussing your concerns directly with your manager," allow people to explore possibilities without feeling controlled. Communication becomes emotionally healthier when advice feels collaborative rather than authoritative. One evening after class in Los Angeles, I sat beside a student who had recently moved to America and was struggling with intense loneliness, homesickness, and cultural exhaustion after months of trying to adapt to unfamiliar social expectations. She spoke quietly about missing her family, her native language, and the emotional comfort of familiar routines, while tears slowly gathered in her eyes despite her obvious effort to remain composed. Instead of interrupting her feelings with immediate encouragement, I listened carefully before responding softly. "I can imagine how emotionally overwhelming this transition must feel for you." Sometimes supportive communication depends not on brilliant advice, but simply on creating emotional space where another person feels safe enough to express vulnerability honestly. Encouragement becomes meaningful only after empathy has established trust and emotional understanding first. As my teaching career continued, I became increasingly fascinated by how subtle differences in language can dramatically influence emotional impact during supportive conversations. I once heard a manager in San Francisco respond to an exhausted employee by saying, "Everybody gets stressed sometimes, you'll be fine." And although the statement was not intentionally cruel, it unintentionally minimized the employee's emotional experience instead of acknowledging it sincerely. Later, I explained to students that emotionally supportive language should validate feelings before offering perspective or encouragement. Phrases like, "That sounds really difficult," or "I'm sorry things have been so overwhelming lately," often create far more emotional comfort than generic positivity alone. Human beings usually calm down faster when they feel emotionally understood rather than emotionally dismissed. Several years ago, I volunteered briefly at a community support center in Denver, where people from different backgrounds gathered to discuss unemployment, family conflict, grief, and emotional exhaustion during difficult periods of life. What surprised me most was how often individuals already knew potential solutions to their problems intellectually, yet still needed emotional encouragement and compassionate listening before feeling capable of moving forward again. One older man described losing confidence completely after repeated job rejections, and another volunteer responded gently by saying, you've already survived a lot more than you realize, which visibly softened the tension inside his expression. Encouraging language becomes powerful when it acknowledges strength people may temporarily struggle to see inside themselves. Communication at its best does not simply transfer information. It restores emotional energy and human dignity during moments of vulnerability. I also teach students that supportive conversations require emotional patience because people rarely heal emotionally according to convenient timelines or simple logical explanations. During one workshop in Washington, a participant admitted frustration because her friend continued discussing anxiety repeatedly despite receiving advice multiple times already. I explained that emotionally distressed people often need repeated reassurance, understanding, and compassionate listening because healing rarely happens in perfectly organized stages. Instead of reacting impatiently, supportive communicators learn to say things like, "Take your time," or "You don't have to figure everything out immediately," because emotional recovery usually depends on gradual stability rather than sudden transformation. Patience itself becomes a form of empathy when people feel emotionally overwhelmed. Another deeply important part of empathetic communication involves recognizing when silence itself may provide more comfort than excessive talking. I remember visiting New York several years ago after a close friend experienced a devastating personal loss, and during our first conversation together, I realized quickly that no clever advice or motivational speech could truly erase the pain she was carrying emotionally. Instead of filling every quiet moment with unnecessary words, I simply remained present, listened carefully, and occasionally offered gentle statements like, "I'm here for you," or "You don't have to go through this alone." Emotional support often depends less on verbal perfection and more on sincere human presence during painful experiences. Some conversations become meaningful precisely because they allow emotions to exist without pressure for immediate resolution. Throughout my years teaching communication, I noticed that students who developed strong empathy skills also became far better conversationalists overall because they stopped focusing exclusively on their own performance and started paying closer attention to emotional dynamics inside interactions. They became more sensitive listeners, more thoughtful advisors, and more emotionally flexible communicators capable of responding naturally to complex human situations. I often reminded them that empathy is not weakness or emotional softness alone. It is one of the most sophisticated communication abilities any person can develop because it requires awareness, patience, emotional intelligence, and genuine concern for others. The strongest communicators are rarely the loudest people in a room. Instead, they are often the individuals who make others feel emotionally heard, respected, and understood even during difficult moments. As we reach the end of this lesson together, I want you to remember that language becomes truly meaningful when it helps human beings support one another through uncertainty, disappointment, loneliness, and emotional struggle. By learning empathetic expressions such as, "I can imagine how hard it must be for you," using thoughtful advice structures like, "If I were in your shoes, I would," and offering encouragement with emotional sincerity rather than empty positivity, you gradually become someone capable of building deeper and more emotionally resilient relationships through communication. In the next and final part of our journey together, we will explore hedging, improvisation, and the subtle art of speaking carefully and flexibly when certainty becomes impossible or words temporarily disappear from your mind during conversation. Empathy strengthens relationships, but in real-life communication, we cannot always speak with absolute certainty. Sometimes, using softer and more careful language is necessary to maintain balance and avoid sounding overly direct. After guiding my students through empathy, emotional support, and the delicate art of listening carefully during difficult conversations, I noticed one final communication challenge appearing repeatedly even among advanced English learners: Many of them still became nervous whenever they could not express ideas perfectly or forgot important vocabulary suddenly in the middle of speaking. I remember standing beside a student after a workshop in San Francisco when he sighed heavily and admitted, "Sometimes I know exactly what I want to say emotionally, but the right word disappears from my mind completely." His frustration reminded me of my own experiences years earlier while traveling abroad and attempting to communicate in languages I had studied imperfectly, because nothing feels more emotionally disorienting than having thoughts trapped inside your mind while words refuse to arrive smoothly. Over time, I realized that truly fluent communicators are not people who always speak perfectly. Instead, they are people who know how to adapt gracefully whenever uncertainty, hesitation, or forgotten vocabulary interrupts the flow of conversation. In this final lesson of our long journey together, I want to teach you the art of hedging, paraphrasing, and improvisation so you can continue communicating naturally even during moments of uncertainty, confusion, or temporary linguistic limitation. Several years ago, while teaching a communication seminar in Chicago, I observed two students debating environmental policies passionately during a group discussion, and although both spoke excellent English grammatically, their communication styles created very different emotional reactions within the room. One student expressed every opinion with absolute certainty, repeatedly saying things like, "This is definitely the only solution, and anyone who disagrees is wrong," while the other used softer structures such as, "It appears that this approach may be more sustainable," and generally speaking, many experts seem to support this idea. Interestingly, listeners responded far more positively to the second speaker because hedging language reduces emotional tension and leaves room for dialogue rather than confrontation. Hedging does not weaken communication. Instead, it demonstrates intellectual flexibility, emotional awareness, and respect for complexity in situations where absolute certainty may not actually exist. Expressions like, "It seems that," to some extent, in many cases, or "there's a possibility that," allow conversations to remain balanced and collaborative rather than emotionally rigid. I still remember a particularly difficult experience early in my teaching career when I accidentally sounded far more confident about a topic than I truly felt internally, and the misunderstanding created unnecessary pressure during an important academic conference in Boston. A participant asked me a complex question about language acquisition psychology, and instead of admitting uncertainty carefully, I responded too directly because I feared appearing inexperienced in front of respected colleagues. Later that evening, I realized how emotionally exhausting it feels to pretend certainty constantly, especially when communication would become far healthier through honesty and nuance. Since then, I have encouraged students to embrace softer structures such as, "From my perspective, based on what I've observed," or "I could be mistaken, but," because emotionally mature communication rarely depends on sounding absolutely certain all the time. Human conversations become more authentic when people acknowledge uncertainty naturally instead of hiding behind artificial confidence. Another important aspect of hedging involves modal verbs because they allow speakers to express probability, possibility, caution, and emotional subtlety without sounding overly forceful or rigid. During one workshop in Seattle, I asked students to compare the emotional difference between saying, "This plan will fail," and "This plan might not work as expected," and immediately they noticed how the second sentence sounded more respectful and collaborative. Modal verbs such as might, could, may, and would soften communication gently while preserving clarity and emotional balance during sensitive discussions. I explained that native speakers constantly use these structures because real life rarely provides complete certainty about future outcomes, emotional reactions, or human behavior. Language becomes more psychologically realistic when speakers allow room for possibility instead of pretending every situation has simple and definite answers. Several years ago, While traveling through Toronto during a winter teaching program, I experienced one of the most embarrassing communication moments of my life when I suddenly forgot a simple English word during a public presentation despite being a native speaker myself. I stood frozen briefly in front of dozens of listeners while searching desperately for the missing vocabulary hidden somewhere inside my exhausted mind, and for several terrifying seconds I felt emotionally exposed and deeply frustrated. Then, almost instinctively, I began describing the object instead of naming it directly, saying, the small device people use to charge laptops while traveling, until the forgotten word finally returned naturally a moment later. That experience changed my understanding of fluency completely because I realized improvisation matters far more than perfect recall. Truly confident communicators continue speaking creatively even when specific vocabulary disappears temporarily. Since that moment in Toronto, I have taught countless students how to paraphrase ideas smoothly whenever forgotten words interrupt conversations unexpectedly. Instead of panicking emotionally, I encourage them to describe functions, appearances, purposes, or related concepts using simpler language already available in their vocabulary. If someone forgets the word microwave, for example, they might say the machine that heats food quickly, and communication can still continue successfully without emotional collapse. During one class in New York, a student forgot the word sunscreen while describing a beach vacation, yet she recovered gracefully by saying, "The cream people put on their skin to avoid getting burned by the sun." Everyone understood her perfectly, and more importantly, the conversation continued naturally because she prioritized communication over perfection. Improvisation transforms mistakes into manageable moments instead of emotional disasters. I also teach students that hesitation itself is not necessarily negative because native speakers constantly pause, restart sentences, and search for words during ordinary conversations without feeling ashamed or incompetent. One afternoon inside a crowded cafe in Los Angeles, I listened carefully to nearby conversations and noticed how frequently people used fillers like, "well, let me think, kind of, and what I'm trying to say is," while organizing thoughts spontaneously. These expressions create emotional breathing space during speech and prevent awkward silence from generating unnecessary anxiety. Many learners mistakenly believe fluent speakers produce perfectly organized sentences instantly. However, real spoken English often contains pauses, revisions, and unfinished ideas because human thinking itself unfolds gradually. Communication becomes far less stressful once people accept that natural conversation rarely resembles polished, written language. Another fascinating element of improvisation involves emotional adaptability because conversations sometimes change direction unexpectedly, forcing speakers to respond without preparation or carefully planned vocabulary. During a conference in Washington, I once received an unexpected question about cultural misunderstandings during international business negotiations, and although I had not prepared specifically for that topic, I relied on paraphrasing, hedging, and flexible explanation strategies to maintain conversational flow calmly. Instead of pretending expertise I did not fully possess, I responded with balanced language, such as, "It seems that many misunderstandings arise from differing expectations around politeness and directness," while carefully building ideas step by step. Listeners responded positively not because every sentence sounded perfect, but because the communication felt thoughtful, flexible, and emotionally grounded. Improvisation succeeds when people prioritize connection and clarity over impossible perfection. Throughout my years teaching communication, I noticed that students who mastered hedging and improvisation eventually became emotionally fearless speakers because they no longer viewed forgotten words or uncertainty as catastrophic failures. They learned to trust their ability to adapt creatively during unpredictable situations rather than depending entirely on memorized structures or perfect preparation. Her description stayed with me because emotional confidence often matters more than technical perfection during real communication. Fluency ultimately depends not on never struggling, but on continuing gracefully despite temporary difficulty or uncertainty. As our long journey together through these 10 lessons finally approaches its conclusion, I find myself reflecting on how deeply communication shapes every part of human life, from casual conversations and emotional storytelling to conflict resolution, cultural exploration, empathy, persuasion, and professional interaction. Throughout this series, I have tried not only to teach vocabulary and structures, but also to reveal the emotional psychology hidden beneath language itself, because communication always involves far more than grammar alone. By learning how to soften statements through hedging, adapt gracefully through paraphrasing, and improvise calmly when certainty disappears or vocabulary fails temporarily, you now possess the final tools necessary for emotionally resilient and flexible communication. Language will always remain imperfect because human beings themselves are imperfect, uncertain, emotional, and constantly evolving through experience. Once you fully master these final improvisation techniques, you will complete the final piece of your communication skill set and confidently handle conversations ranging from basic daily interactions to complex international communication situations. Before we end today's journey together, I want you to remember something very important. Learning English is not only about memorizing vocabulary or mastering grammar rules. It is about slowly building the confidence to express your thoughts, your emotions, and your true personality without fear. Every conversation you practice, every mistake you survive, and every moment you choose to keep speaking instead of giving up is already proof that you are growing stronger day by day. I know the journey can sometimes feel long and frustrating, especially when words disappear from your mind or when native speakers seem impossible to understand. But please do not underestimate how far you have already come. Real fluency is built through patience, courage, and consistency, and the fact that you are here right now, still learning and still trying, already makes you different from the people who gave up too early. If these lessons have helped you feel more confident, more motivated, or more connected to the English language, then I would truly love for you to become part of this growing learning community. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and join me in the next lessons where we will continue exploring English in a deeper, more natural, and more human way together. Your support genuinely means a lot to me, and every like, comment, and subscription helps this channel continue creating meaningful lessons designed to help learners around the world speak English with confidence and heart. Until next time, keep practicing, keep believing in yourself, and most importantly, never be afraid to let your voice be heard.